Worth remembering? 40 years of Aquarius? I think so. I guess the metaphor I had for it was of how it's been in 40 years is my memories of driving around the north coast looking for a site for the festival. We had this idea, the Australian Union of Students, every 2 years was producing a cultural event, sort of an intervarsity that came together, called itself the Aquarius Festival. There were 4 of them. The Aquarius Festival in Nimrod was the 4th of them. And we got to see that in this time of enormous ferment, where protest, right, was second nature to the students of the time. You know, it was entertainment. If you're living in a shared house, student digs, you could expect to be supporting or hiding a draft resistor. All around us was a culture of resistance. And when we came together at Canberra ANU for an intervarsity, a cultural celebration, well, it turned out to be a celebration of protest. And every day, although they had all this other program of intervarsity drama and things like this and performance events, the most interesting events that were happening was that every day there was a food kitchen serving free food, a food cooperative, very new idea at the time, some sort of political debate, discussion, and then a march off from the campus into Canberra to protest at the US Embassy or the South African Embassy or the Parliament itself. But this was a protest, this was a celebration of protest. And we got our heads together, and I had this conversation with Johnny Allen, that what would happen, asked the question, what would happen if we took the Aquarius Festival away from a campus and from a city where we'd have all these things to protest against, and kind of looked inward, turned the light inwards to see what we really believed, what we wanted for the peace. And by this time we'd won the peace. This was obvious to us. In 1966, with Paul's talking about, in 1965 I went to my first protest against the Vietnam War, and there were 50 people in Martin Place, right? In 1966, LBJ came to Australia to promote the war and back the Liberal Party to get elected. The elections were coming up, and their program was all the way with LBJ. What's changed? Total support for the US alliance, which would take us off to the war. They won a landslide victory, although we stopped the motorcade, right? We protesters were just a handful up against this enormous war machine. But because of our resistance to conscription and the war, because of our advocacy for peace, over 6 years this had been turned around, and salutes to people like Jim Cairns for getting this rolling in the ALP. In 6 years, mainly due to the students, right, who were affected personally by conscription, we'd turned this around. And now, in 1971-72, the government that had put this, the Liberal National Party government, the coalition that had put us into this war and introduced conscription, was backing off fast, but not fast enough. They were brought down by the Whitlam, the ALP, in 1972, November 72, the first Labor government in 25 years or something like that. We'd won. We'd won the peace. What was the peace going to look like, was the question we put. So we started going around Australia, having got this job for the Australian Union of Students, the Aquarius Foundation, to produce this festival. Johnny and I started looking out, had this vision of creating an expo, as it were, of the countercultural things which were coming forth. In this cultural resistance, what was happening as people turned away from the war machine? What were they turning towards? Now, it was manifesting itself in lots of ways. I don't want to go into a lecture about the counterculture, but I remember the book that most influenced me was called Where the Wasteland Ends, The Making of a Counterculture. Right? I have this vision. I used to ride a Harley Davidson in those days. Oh, what a chopper. It was the worst thing I ever did. It was most uncomfortable bike, all show, all student radical show. Oh. But riding to the university, these clouds of pollution. It was, the skies were brown. And I think everyone had this feeling. And Rachel Carson's The Silent Spring was out there. We were becoming aware of the effect of insecticides. The idea of ecology had arisen. We had to do something. We had to act for the planet. So getting out of the country was part of this. But I guess we created this experience. I don't want to, there'll be lots of talk about that, and there has been lots of talk what happened at the festival. But it was like it left its seeds. And as I was driving around the country looking for a site for the festival, you could see the remnants of the forest, the ring-bark trees. I mean, when we stood in the main street of Niman, Cullen Street, looking east across where the festival grounds were, the festival grounds itself and that view was a series of 60-foot high hardwoods which had been ring-barked. It was like a forest of hardwoods standing vertical. The locals used to call it vertical firewood. Also widowmakers, they dropped boughs and killed people. But that's how it was. And some of them, you could see, what are they called? The planks the woodsman, the axeman stood on. You could see the bites in the tree going up. And they would often cut them 2 metres up, so they didn't have to cut through the buttress so much. They'd select a place up there. So these stumps were all around the country. And what we became aware of as it drove around was that a lot of these stumps had fig trees growing out the top of them. Juvenile fig trees, yeah? And this was like out of cow munch height. The birds would scrape their beaks and drop the figs on the top of the trunk, and they'd send the seed would hatch and send down a taproot down the side of the tree. Now eventually, as we know about strangler pigs and these things, the whole of that stump would be covered by the buttresses of the trunk as the thing grows. Well, the metaphor was 30 years, 40 years is not a long time for a fig tree. Fig trees live typically 120 years and things like this, and they grow enormous. So that's the metaphor for Aquarius. We were just a seed in an old stump, yeah? We grew slowly, bit by bit, spreading out boughs and producing lots of seeds, right? Lots of fruit, lots of shade, making life much better for the country, but also sending out seeds to other places, yeah? Birds taking them off, various vectors, spreading the ideas that were manifest in Aquarius and were inspired there to new dimensions, yeah? So that's the metaphor I have. So what's the way to the future now? Well, keep going, We're doing pretty well. Celebration, to have a Greens in coalition. That's how far we've come. The ideas we were talking about 40 years ago are now mainstream. The thing I would like to point to, that I would like to see grow and prosper, is the understanding that Aquarius came out of a culture of activism. Yeah? We were protesters. That's how we got here. Right? We were trying to do things differently, and we were willing to put our lives on the line to do this and to create the change, to be the change and create the change. So celebration. The Battle of Terania Creek. Aquarius was 1973, the Battle of Terania Creek was November 78, yes? 79. Just 6 years. Yeah? And at the time that we went into this, and Paul was one of the authors, I was engaged, along with Paul and a few others, how do you get people to this battle, to defend this piece of rainforest? Because everyone was so comfortable. Yeah, everyone was living idyllic lives. I'm talking about the counterculture, the people that came up and built the communes and established families and all that. And the other thing, they had families. I had the same issue. I had young children. How to get people back into activism again. And I remember at the time we weren't sure that it was going to happen. Yeah? When we went to the forest to defend the forest, Dudley was there. I remember the first time we did it, we sort of promoted it at the Channon Market. Hurrah for the Channon Market. That was an establishment that we could use to promote these values. But when we actually went to the forest to plan the blockade, I can remember a circle, Dudley, it wouldn't have been more than 20 people. I'm talking the first circle, before the loggers actually arrived. Yeah? It was small. I remember gathering it. My guess is no more than 12. Mookie was there, Shanto, Ian Gayard was there. Yeah? And we joined hands, right? Came together and sat down and began the planning. Well, to our delight and surprise, for me, surprise, that strength was there in the community. That tradition had not strayed far. It just needed a cause to draw it forth. And how powerful it was. Yeah? The tradition has continued. I mean, there was a second bout of forest fights with Chalundi. There was I think of the Lake Cow campaign. Not the Lake Cow campaign, Timbara against the gold mine. And more recently, the CSG campaign. It seems to me that tradition of activism is well planted in the North Coast. And if anything we were going to cultivate, that's the thing that's going to create the change. To encourage, facilitate, inspire, lead in direct action for peace, for justice, and a sustaining earth. So the question comes now, what can I do and what can we do? We're mostly greyheads. Don't despair, baby boomers. That's the way it is. We have a big role to play even now. I'm 70 years old. Here's some news about the WikiLeaks party. I've been close to John Shipton, the father of Julian Assange, recently. And they've created this WikiLeaks party. It's going to run candidates in New South Wales, Victoria, and South Australia. Senate candidates, and also in particular local seats. To get the WikiLeaks party up, they had to find 500 members to sign up. And guess what? 80% of the people that signed up were baby boomers in the first round, right? When they got their 500. We're still doing it. On most issues, it's baby boomers who are providing the inspiration and the drive behind the scenes, right? 70 years on, 70 years, what can I do? Well, I've never been much of a joiner, never ended up on a commune, and when I did, I got kicked off really early. It's like doing best I can. This is one of my slogans, best I can. I've got to say, Paul, this is the first time I've spoken on a stage in Lismore that I can recall. Although I do a lot of public speaking, not much on the North Coast. Very rarely invited. So this is one of the reasons I travel around in a bus, live in a tradesman's van with speakers on the roof, horn speakers and an amplifier under my bunk. No one. I'm not waiting to be asked to speak when it comes to talking about peace, justice, and the sustaining earth. I'm going to do it anyway. So I'm going to keep doing that. And my particular focus at this time of my life is on peace. Again, as it was when I was a young man. The peace movement has gone very quiet, even though we're in a state of permanent war. It's as if coal seam gas and the forests have distracted the current generation from the importance of peace and working for peace. And it seems obvious to me, and I keep saying it to them, there will be no international agreements on climate change until the resource piracy of the USA and the corporations is roped in. Until we have peace, until we have restrained the rogue states of the United States of America and Israel in particular, no peace, no international agreements. Forget, what did I hear before? The unicorns are okay. So working on both levels, we've not only got to find peace amongst humans. That's the only way we're going to find peace for all the other creatures too, and the right to live. So, unlike Dave, I live in optimism. I live in life, as it were. Life is always recreating itself. And even if we have disasters, there will be life. I don't know that the life form will be me, but I'm with life, and I'll work for it. I take great faith in what's happened over the last 10 years with this endless war. Even though all the resources of corporate media and corporate capitalism have been backing this war, I saw a figure the other day. Halliburton made $31 billion out of the Iraq invasion. $31 billion. This is the kind of corruption, corporate corruption and government corruption we're up against. Right? And they have, with Murdoch media, this enormous power to persuade, or at least to create tsunamis of hysteria and fear amongst the public, so they want to march off to war. I mean, this has been happening always, but they seem to be able to do it with such great skill. I mean, the Twin Towers coming down. I'm an engineer. Steel frame buildings do not collapse with fires in their upper stories. At the worst, you never get it hot enough to melt steel, right? And if it did melt, if it did begin to get so hot, they would bend and warp. They'd be crazy structures, but they wouldn't turn to dust. Yeah? This was an enormous lie. So big, we can't even talk about it when we talk about war and peace in this land. It's just too big, blows people away. Such is the power of the media. And yet, the government and its lies have not been able to convince the Australian people that this war was honest or useful. 72%, consistently, 2/3 of Australians, when asked, will say, out of Afghanistan, out of the wars, give us an inquiry, give us a truth so we don't make this mistake again. What is it? Kind of basic decency that exists amongst us, yeah? I reckon the work's got to be to cultivate that and keep it attached to peace. If I can just stray away, there's another optimism about this. As part of this calculated effort by the corporations and the military state to put us in a culture of permanent war, has been the militarisation of the culture, with vast government investment in military history, as it were. I haven't, it's coming through the Department of Veterans Affairs. I don't know that you are noticing it or being irritated by it. It's like every other month, there's a commemoration of some military aspect of the Australian culture, yeah? This is deliberate cultural policy. They want our young men and women to grow up thinking that's what Australians do. They go off to war. Foreign wars, of course. And yet, what's happened? Although Anzac Day has rocketed, I was in Canberra, 35,000 people turned out for the dawn service. Right? This is amazing. I mean, when I was a child, a young cadet in my school unit, they were lucky if they could get 50 people to the dawn service in my suburb. You know? So this is a huge turnaround. So you would read this as success for the government's policy to militarise Australia and Australian culture and Australian history. But that's not the way it's turning out, right? So I've been working on the Anzac Day, and this year there was a march on the, I need to give you some context. There's been a critique of Anzac written by Marilyn Lake and Henry Reynolds. Henry Reynolds is the famous Frontier Wars history man, black armband history. He's the guy that started it all rolling. Wrote a critique of Anzac called What's Wrong with Anzac? The Militarisation of Australian History. And basically the critique is that Anzac, the way it's grown up and the way the government has been promoting it, is exclusive, right? It only takes a selected view of Australian history and a few wars, but misses out lots. And the major thing they miss out is that as a commemoration of the war dead, it's completely blind to the frontier wars, the colonial wars, the massacres that happened as white people spread around this land. So in response to this, we've created the search for new forms to celebrate Anzac. Now, the reason people seem to be going to Anzac Day, the general theory is that it represents a secular ritual in this time of mass consumption. I'm going to take it back and remind you that the first statement in the manifesto for the Aquarius Festival was that we will not be sold our culture. It was a reaction to consumerism. Well, consumerism hasn't gone away, it's just escalated. Yeah. And in that situation, people are yearning for authenticity. If everything they deal with in the culture is being sold to them, everywhere they look, there's someone attempting to sell something. The inner search, the search for your own authenticity begins with a search for authenticity in your community and amongst your friends. So that explains what's happening with Anzac. It's an attempt to feel something genuine. And what the Australian War Memorial has been very good at is opening up the files. So it's very easy for people to find out about the service histories of members of their families. So there is this also plugging into this search for ancestors, yeah? To feel connected to Australia and the land. Well, in our attempt to put the Frontier War, remembering the Frontier Wars on the agenda for Anzac Day as it approaches the centenary, 2015, of the Gallipoli landing, Michael Anderson, who was one of the founders of the Tent Embassy, well, last man standing, last man alive of the crew that actually set it up, led this Remember the Frontier Wars, tacked it on to the parade, the Anzac Day parade that marched up Anzac Avenue towards the War Memorial. We were only, again, the change makers. Only a few. I think we were 15, of which about 5 were Aboriginal. So we've got at least 10 white guys supporting them, outnumbering them, carrying the flags, carrying the banners, carrying names of the massacres. As we went up the avenue, the crowd, well, this year was about 5,000 people lining the avenue, spontaneously clapped, right? There was this ripple of warm and appreciative applause. This was the 3rd year, the same thing that happened in the 2 previous years. So here we have the situation where the government is saying, if we're going to remember the Frontier Wars, it's going to be in the Australian Museum. It's going to be a little alcove somewhere, with photographs and a bit of print, right? And that'll be it, nicely contained, yeah? But the people who want to understand Australian culture and want to celebrate something that's real about the land here, they were pleased, eager, willing to have the frontier wars, remember, the people being ahead of the government, being streets ahead of the Australian War Memorial. This is what we want. And here it was being said. This is what I talk about, this great sense of, praise be, how blessed we are, deep decency that exists in the population, amongst us as Australians. Oh, I could go on. But I won't, dear friends. You've been sitting through this for too long. Let me say that keeping peace on the agenda is what keeps us honest and real. Yeah? If you want to do something, don't be invisible on peace. Don't think endless war is going to end just being nice to each other at home. It's got to be confronted. Yeah? It's got to be visible. We've got to speak out against it. And we've got to do it not only because it's going to save lives of people overseas, not only because it's going to create a more stable and safe foreign policy for us. We've got to do it because it's good for our hearts. Yeah? It's good for us and our community building if we keep the work of peace front brain. Okay, thank you.